They won't tell you directly that they fear you. They'll dress it up in concern, in unsolicited advice about your future, in questions that sound innocent but carry the weight of judgment. They'll ask when you're going to settle down, when you're going to get serious about life, when you're going to stop being so selfish and think about building something real. But watch their eyes when you tell them you're not interested in marriage, not pursuing the traditional career ladder, not following the script they've all memorized and performed without question. Watch the slight tightening around their mouth, the shift in their posture, the way the conversation suddenly becomes about what's wrong with you rather than what might be right about your choices. That reaction isn't confusion, it's not concern, it's fear. And Nietzsche spent his entire philosophical career understanding exactly why free men terrify people who've surrendered their freedom, why the man who refuses to be domesticated represents an existential threat to everyone who's already been broken and trained and convinced themselves that their captivity is actually wisdom. The free man doesn't just reject the values of the herd, he embodies proof that those values are optional, that the sacrifices everyone else made weren't necessary, that the cage everyone else inhabits is unlocked and always has been, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is more threatening to people who've convinced themselves their suffering is meaningful than someone who's chosen a completely different path and is thriving on it. Here's what you need to understand about fear. It's not rational. It doesn't respond to evidence or argument. It operates at a level beneath conscious thought where threats to identity get processed as threats to survival. When a man chooses freedom, when he opts out of the traditional markers of masculine success like marriage and mortgage and climbing corporate hierarchies, he's not just making a personal choice, he's challenging the entire value system that other people have organized their lives around. Every married man who sees you happy and unmarried has to confront the possibility that his marriage isn't actually necessary for fulfillment. Every man grinding away at a job he hates to support a family he barely sees has to question whether that sacrifice is actually noble or just the result of limited imagination about what's possible. Every person who's subordinated their individual will to collective expectations has to face the uncomfortable reality that they chose captivity when freedom was always available. You represent the road not taken, the life they could have lived if they'd had the courage to resist the programming. And that makes you dangerous not because of anything you're doing to them, but because of what your existence reveals about their own choices. Nietzsche called this the slave revolt in morality, the way people who've accepted subordination redefine values to make their weakness look like strength, their compliance look like virtue, their fear look like wisdom. They can't simply admit that they chose safety over freedom because they were afraid, that they followed the script because resisting it was too uncomfortable, that they surrendered their individual will because maintaining it required more courage than they possessed. So instead, they have to redefine freedom as irresponsibility, independence as selfishness, refusal to conform as immaturity. They have to create a moral framework where their choices are elevated as superior and your choices are diminished as deficient, not because the evidence supports this framework, but because their psychological survival depends on it. If freedom is actually superior to captivity, if independence actually leads to greater fulfillment than subordination, if choosing your own path actually results in a richer life than following someone else's script, then they've wasted their lives on a lie. That possibility is so threatening that it has to be destroyed. And since they can't destroy the possibility itself, they try to destroy you, not physically but socially, by positioning you as someone to be pitied or scorned, rather than someone who might actually have figured something out that they missed. Let me describe the specific ways this fear manifests, because it's important to recognize the patterns, so you don't internalize other people's projections as legitimate criticism. First, there's the concern trolling, where people express worry about your future, about what will happen when you're old and alone, about whether you're thinking long-term, about whether you've really considered the implications of your choices. This sounds like genuine care, but it's actually an attempt to transfer their own fears onto you, to make you doubt your path by suggesting dangers that probably aren't real or aren't as significant as they're being portrayed. The person asking if you've thought about who will take care of you when you're old hasn't actually thought about whether being married guarantees care in old age. Plenty of married people end up alone or in nursing homes while their children live across the country and visit twice a year. But the question isn't really about your welfare. It's about their need to believe that their choice to marry and have children was practically necessary, rather than just one option among many. Second, there's the moralization, where your choices get framed as ethical failures rather than just different preferences. You're selfish for not having children. Never mind that having children could be equally framed as selfish, bringing new consciousness into a world of suffering to fulfill your own needs for meaning, or legacy, or genetic continuation. You're immature for not wanting marriage. Never mind that staying married often requires suppressing your actual growth to maintain domestic stability. You're irresponsible for not following a traditional career path. Never mind that traditional careers often mean selling your life in increments to build someone else's vision, rather than your own. The moral language is deployed to create shame, to position you as someone who's failing at basic human decency, rather than someone who's chosen a different set of values and is living according to them with integrity. Nietzsche would recognize this immediately as ressentiment, the psychological mechanism where people who feel powerless try to gain power by redefining the moral landscape to elevate their weakness and diminish others' strength. Third, there's the prediction of future suffering, where people insist that you'll eventually regret your choices, that you'll wake up at 40 or 50 and realize you've missed out on what really matters, that you'll end up bitter and alone wishing you'd done things differently. This prediction serves multiple functions simultaneously. It allows them to dismiss your current happiness as temporary or illusory, something that will inevitably give way to the suffering they need you to experience to validate their own choices. It positions their path as the one true path that you'll eventually recognize once you've matured enough to understand what they already know. And most importantly, it allows them to avoid confronting the possibility that you might actually remain happy with your choices, that freedom might continue to serve you better than captivity would have, that their predictions are just projections of their own regrets onto your future. The person telling you that you'll regret not having children is often someone who has children and is managing their own complicated feelings about that choice by insisting that the alternative would have been worse. Fourth, there's the social exclusion, where you gradually get frozen out of social circles because your presence makes other people uncomfortable. Married friends stop inviting you to gatherings because you remind their spouses that marriage was optional, that their husbands chose this life rather than having it be the only possibility. Parents stop including you in family events because you represent the path their children might take, if they're exposed to the idea that traditional markers of success aren't mandatory. Colleagues stop seeing you as serious because you're not displaying the markers of stability and responsibility they associate with professional credibility. This exclusion isn't personal, it's protective. People are protecting their own value systems by removing evidence that contradicts those systems, creating echo chambers where everyone reinforces everyone else's choices, and nobody has to confront alternative possibilities that might reveal their choices as less inevitable or less optimal than they need to believe. Now let's talk about why this fear is actually intensifying in the modern world, rather than diminishing. Because you might think that as society becomes more accepting of different life paths, the fear of free men would decrease. But the opposite is happening. As traditional institutions become less stable, as marriage rates decline and divorce rates stay high, as more people are openly questioning whether the script they were sold actually delivers what it promised, the people who are still committed to that script become more defensive and more aggressive about protecting it. They can't afford to be tolerant of alternatives because the alternatives are becoming more visible and more viable, which makes their own choices look less like wise decisions and more like capitulations to social pressure and biological programming. The free man used to be rare enough to be dismissed as an aberration, but as more men choose freedom and demonstrate that it's a viable path, the threat becomes existential rather than theoretical. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments because I want to understand the geography of this fear, where choosing freedom still gets you completely ostracized versus where there's emerging space for alternative paths, where the herd's grip is tightest versus where it's starting to loosen. The pressure to conform varies dramatically by location and culture, and mapping that variation tells me a lot about where this message will resonate most strongly and where it will generate the most violent resistance. Here's the paradox that makes the fear of free men so intense. The people who fear you the most are often the ones who are closest to choosing freedom themselves. The person who's most aggressive about questioning your choices is usually someone who seriously considered the same path, but ultimately couldn't pull the trigger, who stood at the crossroads and chose safety over freedom, and has been living with that choice ever since. Your freedom reminds them of their own moment of decision, of the path they almost took, of the life they might have lived. And that reminder is unbearable because it means they have to confront not just that they made a choice, but that they made it out of fear, that they had the option to be free and chose captivity instead, that they could have been where you are, but lacked the courage or clarity or conviction to follow through. This is why the criticism often feels so personal, so emotionally charged, so disproportionate to what you're actually doing. It's not really about you. It's about their relationship with their own abandoned possibilities. Nietzsche understood that the herd doesn't just fear the free man's choices. It fears the implications of those choices for its own identity and coherence. If one person can opt out of the herd's values and thrive, then those values aren't universal truths about how humans should live. They're just one option among many. If one person can build a meaningful life without marriage, without children, without traditional career success, without subordinating individual will to collective expectations, then all the suffering the herd has accepted as necessary might have been optional. That possibility threatens the entire moral framework the herd uses to make sense of its suffering, the framework that says sacrifice is noble, that duty is virtuous, that subordination to collective values is the mark of mature adulthood. Your freedom doesn't just challenge specific choices, it challenges the entire system of meaning that makes those choices tolerable for the people who made them. Let's examine the specific accusations that get leveled at free men, because understanding these accusations reveals exactly what the herd fears and why. The first and most common accusation is selfishness, the claim that choosing freedom means prioritizing your own desires over your obligations to others, to potential future partners, to potential future children, to society at large. But notice what this accusation assumes, that you have obligations to people who don't exist yet, that your life belongs to society's expectations rather than to your own vision, that serving collective reproduction is morally superior to developing your individual capacities. Nietzsche would immediately recognize this as slave morality, trying to guilt you into accepting chains, trying to position your strength and independence as moral failures that need to be corrected. The person calling you selfish for not having children isn't making a reasoned ethical argument. They're trying to shame you into making the same sacrifices they made so they don't have to confront the possibility that those sacrifices weren't necessary. The second accusation is immaturity, the claim that you haven't grown up yet, that you're stuck in an adolescent mindset of avoiding responsibility and commitment. But what does maturity actually mean in this context? It means accepting the herd's definition of adult life, subordinating your will to domestic and professional obligations, giving up on dreams that don't fit within the constraints of marriage and family and conventional career paths. It means becoming predictable, manageable, useful to systems that profit from your compliance. Real maturity might actually be the opposite, having the clarity to examine what you actually want, rather than what you've been programmed to want, having the courage to build a life according to your own values rather than someone else's script, having the integrity to remain true to yourself, even when that means resisting enormous social pressure to conform. The person calling you immature for not settling down is often someone who settled before they figured out who they actually were, who prioritized fitting in over finding out what they were capable of becoming. The third accusation is that you're running from something, from intimacy, from responsibility, from real connection, from the hard work of building something with another person. This accusation is particularly insidious because it positions freedom as avoidance, rather than as an active choice, as something you're doing because you're damaged or afraid rather than because you've genuinely examined your options and chosen the path that serves your development. But consider the possibility that you're not running from intimacy. You're running towards something more important than the specific form of intimacy the herd recognizes as valid. You might have deeper connections with friends than most married people have with their spouses. You might be building something more meaningful than a household. You might be developing capacities that would be impossible if your resources were consumed by domestic obligations. The person accusing you of running is often someone who's actually running from themselves, who entered into commitments to avoid confronting questions about identity and purpose and meaning that remain unanswered beneath the busy work of maintaining relationships and managing households. The fourth accusation is that you'll end up alone, that your choices are leading you toward isolation and loneliness, that you're sacrificing future connection for present independence. This accusation reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of connection and loneliness. Being married doesn't guarantee connection. Plenty of married people are profoundly lonely, living with someone they barely know anymore, performing intimacy they don't feel, maintaining relationships more out of habit and financial entanglement than actual desire to be together. Being unmarried doesn't guarantee loneliness. Many unmarried people have rich social lives, deep friendships, romantic connections that don't require legal and financial binding, communities organized around shared interests rather than shared domestic space. The person warning you about ending up alone is often someone who's already alone despite being partnered, who's projecting their own isolation onto your future to avoid confronting their present reality. Nietzsche would say that all of these accusations are attempts to enforce herd conformity through moral manipulation, to make you doubt yourself by suggesting that your difference is deficiency, that your strength is actually weakness, that your clarity is actually confusion. The herd can't tolerate too much deviation, because deviation threatens the consensus that makes the herd's suffering tolerable, the consensus that says everyone is basically living the same way because it's the only right way, that anyone living differently is either tragically misguided or morally deficient. Your freedom breaks that consensus, proves that alternatives exist and can work, and therefore must be delegitimized before other people start questioning whether they need to follow the script they've been sold. But here's what the herd doesn't understand and can't afford to acknowledge. The free man isn't actually a threat to them, unless they choose to see him that way. Your choices don't invalidate their choices unless they need external validation to believe their choices were correct. Your happiness doesn't diminish their happiness unless their happiness is dependent on believing that everyone who made different choices must be unhappy. Your freedom doesn't imprison them unless they're already feeling imprisoned and using your supposed mistakes to justify remaining in captivity. The fear isn't rational. It's not based on any actual danger you pose. It's based on what your existence reveals about possibilities they've foreclosed, about roads they didn't take, about lives they might have lived if they'd had the courage to resist the programming that got them where they are. Let me describe what actual freedom looks like, because there's often confusion about what we're talking about when we say a man chooses freedom. It's not about being commitment phobic or refusing all responsibilities or living in a state of perpetual adolescence. It's about maintaining sovereignty over your own existence, making choices based on your actual values rather than on social expectations, building a life that reflects your vision rather than someone else's script. A free man might have deep committed relationships, but those relationships are chosen continuously rather than locked in through legal and financial mechanisms that make exit catastrophically costly. A free man might work very hard and take on significant responsibilities, but those responsibilities are aligned with his own goals, rather than imposed by obligations to dependents he never genuinely wanted. A free man might sacrifice enormously for projects he cares about, but those sacrifices serve his vision of what makes life meaningful, rather than serving biological imperatives or social expectations he never examined. The free man's life is characterized not by absence of commitment, but by conscious choice about what he's committing to and why. He's not drifting through existence avoiding anything difficult. He's deliberately constructing a life according to principles he's actually examined rather than principles he inherited. He's not refusing to grow up. He's refusing to accept the herd's definition of growth, which usually means becoming more domesticated, more predictable, more useful to systems that don't serve his interests. He's not damaged or afraid or incomplete. He's operating according to a different set of values that prioritize individual development over collective reproduction, that value sovereignty over security, that measure success by internal standards of growth and achievement rather than external markers of conformity. This is what the herd fears. Not that you're going to fail, but that you're going to succeed. Not that you're going to end up miserable and alone, but that you're going to end up fulfilled and connected in ways they can't access because they've subordinated their individual will to collective expectations. Not that you're making a mistake, but that you're making a choice that works better than the choice they made. Your potential success is more threatening than your potential failure, because failure would validate their decisions, while success challenges the entire framework they use to understand what makes a life valuable. This is why they need to predict your future suffering, need to find current evidence of your deficiency, need to position you as someone to be pitied rather than possibly envied, because the alternative is confronting questions about their own lives that they've spent years avoiding. Nietzsche wrote about the Übermensch, the overman, the person who creates their own values rather than accepting the values of the herd, who lives according to their own vision rather than according to inherited scripts. The free man is moving in this direction, not perfectly, not completely, but directionally toward greater self-authorship and away from subordination to collective expectations. And the herd fears the Übermensch for exactly the same reason it fears the free man, because the Übermensch proves that the herd's values aren't universal truths, but contingent choices, that the suffering the herd accepts as necessary might be optional, that there are other ways to live that might be superior to the ways the herd has organized itself. The Übermensch doesn't need the herd's validation, doesn't operate according to the herd's moral framework, doesn't measure success by the herd's standards, and that independence is terrifying to people whose entire identity is built on conformity to collective values. Now let's talk about what you actually do with the fear that your freedom generates. Because understanding that people fear you isn't enough. You need strategies for navigating that fear without either capitulating to it or letting it poison your relationships with everyone who hasn't chosen your path. The first and most important strategy is recognizing that their fear is about them, not about you. When someone criticizes your choices, questions your path, predicts your future suffering, they're processing their own relationship with their own choices, their own foreclosed possibilities, their own doubts about whether they made the right decisions. You can't fix that for them. You can't convince them that your path is valid because they're not actually questioning the validity of your path. They're defending themselves against implications they can't afford to confront. The most compassionate response is often just to hold your ground without being aggressive about it, to make it clear that you've examined your choices and are committed to them without needing to convince anyone else that those choices are correct. The second strategy is finding your people, because not everyone fears freedom. Some people recognize it and respect it even if they've chosen different paths for themselves. There are married people who genuinely support your choice to remain unmarried because they're secure in their own choices and don't need everyone else to make the same choice to validate their own. There are parents who respect your choice not to have children because they had children consciously, and understand that it's one option among many, rather than a universal obligation. There are professionals who respect your non-traditional career path because they understand that there are multiple ways to build meaningful work. These people exist. They're just quieter than the people who fear you, because they're not motivated by the same defensive anxiety that makes other people loud and aggressive in their criticism. Finding these people, building relationships with them, creating communities organized around respect for individual paths rather than enforcement of collective conformity. This is how you maintain social connection without constantly defending yourself against projections. The third strategy is developing genuine indifference to the herd's opinion, not the performative kind where you're constantly announcing how much you don't care what people think, but the deep kind where you genuinely stop tracking social approval as a meaningful metric of whether you're living well. This is harder than it sounds because humans are social creatures wired to care about status and belonging. but it's achievable through practice and conscious recalibration of your values. Every time you feel defensive about someone's criticism, that's information about where you're still seeking external validation, where you're still measuring yourself against the herd's standards rather than your own. The goal isn't to become completely disconnected from social feedback. That would be pathological. The goal is to distinguish between feedback that's actually useful for your development and feedback that's just the herd trying to bring you back into conformity. So useful feedback challenges you to grow according to your own values. Herd feedback challenges you to abandon your values in favor of collective expectations. The fourth strategy is being willing to lose relationships that are contingent on your conformity, because some people will not be able to maintain connection with you if you continue choosing freedom. Family members who need you to follow the script to validate their own choices. Friends who can't handle the implicit challenge your path represents to their own decisions. Partners who want the social legitimacy and security of traditional arrangements rather than the uncertainty of conscious ongoing choice. Losing these relationships is painful, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but maintaining them at the cost of your freedom is more painful in the long run. It's a slow death of self to preserve connections with people who don't actually want to connect with who you actually are. They want to connect with who they need you to be, to make their own lives make sense. Nietzsche would say that the person who needs the herd's approval isn't free yet, that real freedom requires being willing to stand alone, if that's what living according to your values demands. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Choosing freedom doesn't mean you're alone. It means you're selectively connected to people and projects and purposes that actually align with who you are, rather than being indiscriminately connected to whoever happens to share your zip code, or your family tree, or your demographic category. The free man often has deeper, richer, more authentic connections than the person who's maintained surface relationships with everyone, by never threatening anyone with difference, by always performing conformity, by subordinating their actual self to whatever version of self the situation requires. Quality of connection matters more than quantity, and freedom allows for quality because you're showing up as yourself, rather than as a performance designed to manage other people's comfort levels. Nietzsche remained largely isolated during his productive years, not because he was incapable of connection, but because maintaining his intellectual freedom required distance from people who would have pulled him toward conformity, who would have demanded he modify his thinking to be more palatable, who would have positioned his insights as evidence of imbalance rather than as genuine breakthroughs in understanding. He chose productive isolation over comfortable conformity, chose depth over breadth, chose a few genuine connections over many superficial ones. Whether that was the right choice is debatable. Whether it was a choice made with full awareness of the costs and benefits rather than an unconscious default is what made it an exercise of freedom rather than a capitulation to fear. Here's the ultimate truth about why men who choose freedom are quietly feared. They represent the possibility that the emperor has no clothes, that the sacrifices everyone else made weren't necessary, that the suffering everyone else accepted as inevitable was actually optional, that the cage everyone else inhabits is unlocked, and always has been. That possibility is so threatening to people's sense of meaning and identity that it has to be destroyed. And since they can't destroy the possibility itself without confronting it honestly, they try to destroy the messenger. They position you as deficient, as immature, as running from something, as heading toward disaster, anything to avoid confronting what your existence implies about their own choices. The fear you generate isn't about you, it's about them, about their relationship with their own foreclosed possibilities, about whether they've built lives that actually reflect their values or just lives that reflect their programming. Your responsibility isn't to make them comfortable with your choices, isn't to justify yourself to people who aren't actually asking questions but making accusations, isn't to shrink yourself to fit into categories that were never designed to accommodate people who think for themselves. Your responsibility is to live with integrity according to values you've actually examined, to build something meaningful with the freedom you've claimed, to demonstrate through your actual life rather than through argument that there are multiple ways to live well, and the herd's way isn't the only way. The person who's genuinely free doesn't spend time arguing about whether freedom is superior to captivity, They just live freely and let the results speak for themselves. They understand that some people will fear them regardless of what they do, that no amount of success or happiness or fulfillment will convince people who need them to fail, that the only path forward is continuing to walk your own path, while remaining open to genuine connection with people who can handle your difference. So what do you do when someone expresses fear of your freedom disguised as concern for your welfare? You thank them for their concern, you make it clear you've thought carefully about your choices, and then you change the subject or end the conversation. You don't owe anyone a detailed justification for living differently. You don't need to convince anyone that your path is valid. You don't have to defend yourself against predictions of future suffering that are really just projections of present regret. You live your life, you build your projects, you develop your capacities, you create your connections, and you let the people who can't handle your freedom fall away while remaining open to the people who can. This isn't cold. This isn't dismissive. This is just recognizing that you can't fix other people's relationship with their own choices. You can only make your own choices with as much consciousness and integrity as possible, and accept that not everyone will understand or support those choices. Nietzsche wrote that you must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. That creative power requires internal turbulence, that the person who's completely domesticated and peaceful has nothing left to create. The free man maintains that chaos, maintains that turbulence, maintains that creative potential by refusing to be completely domesticated, completely predictable, completely subordinated to collective expectations. And yes, that makes people uncomfortable, makes them fearful, makes them want to break you down and reshape you into something safer. But their discomfort is the price of your vitality. Their fear is evidence that you're doing something right, that you're maintaining sovereignty in a world designed to extract it from you, and convince you that the extraction is actually liberation. Write in the comments right now, I choose sovereignty over approval, because that declaration is how you start reclaiming power from the people who've been using their fear to control your choices, who've been using social pressure to make you doubt whether your path is valid. Subscribe to this channel, because we're continuing to explore what it actually takes to remain free in a world that profits from your domestication, that needs your compliance, that fears your independence. Hit that like button because this message needs to reach the men who are currently doubting themselves, who are surrounded by people questioning their choices, who need to know that the fear they're generating is actually evidence they're on the right path. Keep watching because what's coming next will challenge everything you think you know about power, purpose, and what it actually means to live according to your own values rather than someone else's script. And you need to hear it before you make another decision based on managing other people's comfort, rather than maximizing your own development.